Welcome back, everybody. This is our last lecture on ancient Greece, the Hellenistic era. So some things to be aware of stylistically. Really look at the change from some of the more stiff and formal poses that we've seen in the classical era toward an increased interest in dynamic movement, emotional expression, and also depiction of people who are no longer just physical ideals. We'll start to see portraiture and sculpture that seems to suggest that the individual expressive features of an individual's face are becoming more and more acceptable to Greek artists. So we enter into the Hellenistic era, the period between the death of Alexander the Great and the absorption of Greece into the Roman Empire. And so the Macedonian king Philip II, who had conquered Greece, passed the kingdom on to his son Alexander. And then Alexander entered into a highly successful war against the Persian Empire and had absorbed most of the Persian Empire into his own empire. However, when he died, the lands were split among his four generals. There was quite a lot of conflict in trying to decide how the states were going to be subdivided after his death. And so it really is sort of the beginning end for ancient Greece. But what's kind of interesting is that the center of Greek culture now moves off the Greek mainland, and we start seeing sites that are really important in Greek art making that fall outside of the mainland of Greece itself. We know that Lysippus served as a portrait artist for Alexander the Great. We've already looked a little bit at some of these portraits and the suggestion that the attempt to start to make them individually recognizable portraits as opposed to classical idealized examples or almost symbolic representations of human faces and bodies is becoming more important. This technically probably should be classified as a Roman artwork, as it does actually come to us from the city of Pompeii. This is a mosaic copy of an original painting by the Greek painter Philoxenos of Etria. And what we're looking at here is the best example I can give you of what we think the Greek style of fresco painting would have looked like. So the figures that we can recognize really clearly, the two largest and most engaged figures, include Alexander here, who is fighting Darius, who is the king and the leader of the Persian Empire. And in fact, Alexander defeats Darius in two significant battles in order to gain control of the Persian Empire. So if you look closely, you can see that although enlarged, the eye on the portrait face of Alexander is in the correct profile view as opposed to in a fully facing frontal view. So we're starting to see even more naturalism. You can see that in the foreshortening in his hand, and that's even more remarkable to consider that this piece is created entirely out of mosaic tiles. So tesserae, which comes from the Greek word for square or cube, refers to four-sided small rectangular or square tiles that are used to make up these images. So even though it appears to us at a distance that there's a soft transition from light to dark values as light moves across the contours of these figures, the horse in particular, I think, is an area you can really notice changes in light to dark color value across the contours of his body. All of that is achieved by carefully placing different colored pieces of glass or stone. Remarkable accomplishment. So mosaic is the technique, and the tesserae are the individual pieces. So it's not unusual to see these much more dynamic mosaics, particularly floor mosaics, throughout the Hellenistic era. There's also a fair amount of preserved wall painting in tombs from the Hellenistic era. You can certainly see that here. The foreshortening on the horse figure and on the arms of these figures does seem to suggest that the Greek painters probably were quite adept at creating three-dimensional illusion. The major change, though, in the artwork of the Hellenistic era is really this intense interest in describing movement, dynamic dramatic narratives, and even in greater increased expression of emotion. Now, this is an odd case for us. This particular sculpture is likely part of a monument that has been lost and only a few portions of it remain, and they're in fact in different museums. So the diagram gives you what we think this monument must have looked like. And it's an odd monument for a Greek artist to be tasked with creating, because instead of depicting the Greeks themselves as victorious over their enemy, what you're actually seeing here is kind of an homage to the bravery of a people that they defeated. So although the Greeks still emerge victorious and they still see themselves, of course, as vastly superior, they are, in a weird way, honoring the nobility, such as they saw it, of their enemies. This is part of a monument that is commemorating war of the Greeks against the Gaelic people, or the Gauls. They come from northern Europe, and so sections of territory that they occupied now equate with modern day France. Uh, they were invaders who were fierce fighters, and it took the Greeks a lot of effort to defeat them in battle. So although they still saw themselves as morally superior, intellectually superior, culturally superior, the sculpture is pretty remarkable in that it shows not just a little bit of compassion, but also it somewhat gives some glorification to, even though they weren't able to defeat the Greeks, it does make the Gauls seem as if they were a worthy combative force. So what you're seeing here is a Gaelic chieftain, a Gaul, who has killed his own wife and is now committing ritual suicide in order to protect them from being killed by the Greeks whom they are fighting. Perhaps the most famous of the sculptures from this ruined monument is this one, the Dying Gall. And he is really kind of a remarkable piece in that we still get the sense of otherness from him. Look at his wild, kind of unkempt hair, the mustache, even the torque that he wears around his neck indicates that he's definitely not an ancient Greek. But you can see that he is still somewhat idealized in the body, and certainly you can see the wound, especially in his side here. You can see that he is dying, he's suffering, and it does evoke a sense of emotional response from us. We can still sort of look down on him as a defeated enemy, I suppose, if we're looking at it through ancient Greek Hellenistic eyes, but we can also look at a way of honoring this person, in a sense, that even though they are perhaps beneath us culturally, they were difficult to defeat and tested us through their own strength. It's an way of thinking about how to create a monument to a war. Certainly the style that you're seeing here, which comes much, much later in European art, is obviously really closely modeled off of sometimes even the poses of the art of the classical world. So when we start looking into the next unit, when we look at the art of ancient Rome, remember that Rome is absorbing a lot of the cultural traditions that we've seen up to this point, and then that is going to be the launching pad for what we'll see in the Renaissance for those who are taking or will take Art History Survey 2. And of course, the Renaissance then will influence the style of painting that you're seeing here, which comes to us from the tradition of Jacques-Louis David in the neoclassical era in France. Another remarkable piece that we really need to spend some time with is the Laocoon sculpture. And Laocoon is a prophet. He actually prophesies the correct outcome of the Trojan War. He, in fact, knows that the gift of the Trojan horse is coming, and that the Trojan horse is actually a false gift, that it encloses or hides attacking forces, and that it will be the downfall of the city of Troy at the hands of the Greeks. So the sculpture is perhaps more significant for us in some respects for its influence into the Renaissance and into today. It looks in some ways un-Greek compared to what we saw in the previous two lectures. There's far more movement. The figure, in fact, the main figure of the father, Laocoon, towers over his sons on a diagonal line surrounded by this swirl of serpentine form. He is being devoured by serpents. The gods, of course, were taking bets, making wagers over the outcome of the Trojan War, and the gods divided themselves. They took sides. And so this is an attempt by the gods to prevent the prophet from revealing the secret. So in order to maintain their own stakes in the war, the gods send this sea serpent to devour not only the prophet, but also his two sons. So the sculpture has some remarkable aspects. That the figures of the sons definitely are significantly shorter if they all were able to stand fully upright. The father figure would tower over them like a giant. And based on the musculature of the bodies, they're clearly not meant to be young children, pre-teens, but it looks like that would be about the height ratio. So we are seeing still a holdover of that hierarchical scale, that the father, being the most important character, is presented to us at a large scale. But we're also seeing a really unusually dramatic sense of storytelling. There's a lot of tragedy here. There is obvious facial expression. And again, I suppose that's acceptable because this would be the prophet on the losing side, the non-Greek side, so he can be a little bit more wild and a little more emotive. But you don't see a Greek equivalent in the statue. You don't see a rational Greek figure feeding him in battle. Instead, the focus is purely on the movement, the agony, the tension in the body. And of course, it's an excuse for the sculptor to give us the most extreme anatomical study, I think, that we've seen up to this point. The body is sort of hyper muscled and yet seems fully believable to us. Even the figures of the sons, I think, seem to conform to the Lysipian version of the proportion canon that we learned about. They're a little more elegant than the classical figures, but even they move in much more of a curved and angled manner than their predecessors that we've seen in other sculptures. So the Laocoon group is also pretty remarkable because it was lost. The sculpture was unearthed in Italy, and believe it or not, Michelangelo was one of the people who was present when the piece was uncovered and was being restored. So the version that you're seeing here, the photograph you're seeing on this slide, is the original restoration. Obviously, the sculpture had been damaged, and so the artists of the Renaissance were tasked with trying to reconstruct and fill in pieces. We now know that the current state that it's in is more than likely the accurate original sculptural form. Michelangelo himself was asked at one point to participate in reconstructing it, and he actually refused. But the artists who created the piece, this is another sculpture by the same trio of sculptors working together, Athandros, Hagisandros, and Polydorus. These three sculptors who created the Laocoon group obviously paid a lot of attention to the physical anatomy also of the face. And you can see that here in this head of Odysseus from their workshop. And you can see, if you combine the idea of the muscularity and this kind of old and wise face that they seem to favor, you can really start to see that in the work of Michelangelo himself. Michelangelo, early in his career, even created works intentionally to try to mimic the work of ancient Greece and Rome. And you see that in his very early statue there, 1497 CE, the statue of the Bacchus. And that piece led directly to his commission to create the Pietà for a French cardinal. And then from that point forward, he very rapidly rose to prominence. He was tasked not soon after the completion of the piece that you see in the middle of the screen there with the commission for a tomb for Pope Julius II, and that tomb seems to really be an inheritor of the Laocoon sculpture that we just saw. The body, and especially the face of Moses, the main figure in the tomb of Pope Julius, which was completed about 1515. So not long after Michelangelo had seen the Laocoon group for himself. You can really feel that influence coming forward. So when we talk about the reason that we study art history and we think about the impact of these ancient cultures, it's not just because it's what everyone has studied before you. It has to do with how those cultures have shaped the cultures that are shaping the world that you live in now. So even though these things are so many hundreds of years in the past, they do begin to affect arts closer to your own time period that is still affecting artists who are making work today. You can certainly see with the Hellenistic style that there are more diverse poses. The figures tend to have a little bit more expressive positioning of the limbs of the body. And of course, again, we're looking at a Roman copy of a Greek original, but that Greek original sculpture certainly has more movement than what we saw when we started off with those Kouros figures. A Hellenistic sculpture definitely to know for the test is Nike of Samothrace. She is, of course, the winged figure of victory, and she very much continued the tradition that we saw of the quote-unquote wet drapery technique, allowing the female body to be exposed and demurely covered where appropriate. But it also gives us that sense of increased movement and dynamism that is key to the Hellenistic style. This figure strides forward and was intended symbolically to be the figurehead of a boat. And it wasn't a boat that actually ever sailed, but we have a reconstruction idea of what she likely would have looked like. You can imagine this as a symbol of absolute victory and a symbol that not only moves forward in her own body, but the sculptural setting or architectural setting of the carved boat gives you that feeling of movement as well. Pretty remarkable piece. We definitely see more nude women and partially nude women in the the Hellenistic era, and you can see that what's really happening here is not that much more revealing than the sculptures that we saw in the style of Phidias. We saw that curvature of the drapery covering discreetly certain areas on the body and then being pulled tightly to reveal areas like the breast or the thigh. Now the artists are beginning to be able to be free from the need to cover the body and able to explore the sensuality of the female form in much more detail and more freely than the artists of the archaic or the classical period. This is the Aphrodite known as the Venus de Milo, discovered within the ancient ruins of the city of Milo, so Venus of Milo. That's where we get the name. Definitely, we are seeing portions of what of what remains of the statue, so we have to kind of imagine what she would have done with the arm positions. And this is a pretty good example, I think, of what the original pose probably looked like. There are other possibilities, of course. One of my personal favorites from the Hellenistic period, though, is the Old Market Woman. This sculpture is so unusual in comparison to what we learned about at the beginning of Greek culture. We would never have seen a sculpture of someone this common or this old, and certainly not with this much attention to the body if they were depicted as elderly. So it's not someone from a heroic myth. It's not a goddess. This is an old woman going to market, and you can see that she has been rendered in far more naturalistic detail in the face and in the pose of the body than any of the figures that we've seen up to this point. She also has a bit of that peekaboo wet drapery technique. You can see the thigh and knee very clearly on both legs, but you get a sense of her age and the burden of the weight that she's carrying. The figures begin to move far more than any of the statues that we started with. You can see that in so many sculptures. It's unfortunate that so many of the things we can look at are not the originals. We can only imagine how much more emotion there might have been in the originals. You know, quite frequently a copy tends to lose something in its translation. You can see even the curvature in the eyebrows in this head that seem to really begin to express a bit of worry, anxiety, or concern. We can start to get a sense of the artists of the Hellenistic era trying more and more to make us feel when we see these works. Pleiuktos, sculpture of Democenes is an important example as well. This one is, again, a Roman copy, but it's a Roman copy of a really kind of unusual Greek sculpture in that the figure is not presented in his heroic muscled youth, but in his mid to late age. And it's also very important for us, I think, to think of this as kind of a model of what the Roman Empire is going to do increasingly. The Roman sculptures that you'll see will blow your mind with the amount of realism that they're able to pack into their depictions of specific individuals. And it really does begin here in the Hellenistic era in Greece. You see lots of subjects that have more movement, more humor, more emotion, more expression of what it seems to be is the artists observing real in the real world. The way that the figure of Cupid here sleeps looks like it was modeled by someone who had observed how children can fall asleep in unusual and theoretically uncomfortable positions and yet give us a sense of reality. The boxer feels real. He doesn't feel as much like an idealized type any longer. The body looks even a little the worse for wear for his age. You certainly see more scenes that tend toward erotic subjects in the sculpture. You can certainly see that here. And certainly in this figure as well, this seated faun is a definite piece that calls out the idea of the obsession with the body. This is some later examples of Greek architecture. Obviously, we're now moving into the Corinthian style, and you can see pretty clearly here in the temple of the Olympian Zeus at Athens how much thinner, how much taller the Corinthian order ultimately is than the Ionic order that we looked at most recently. You can see that these temple structures became really pretty complex. And as we look at the floor plans, the reconstructions of what we have left now only as ruins, you can see that some of the temples are even temples inside of larger temple buildings themselves. So the taste for simplicity in architecture goes away. The taste for order remains, and we certainly see that in reconstructions of Greek cities, we begin to see that they're very orderly in the organization of streets and terraces, and the inclusion of the large public open spaces becomes really important as well. We call those public spaces agora, and the agora can house various temples, various shrines, and other enclosures, but it's a public space, and we'll see that increasingly as we move into the architecture of the ancient Romans. This is the stoa, which is essentially a series of offices and shops, kind of the precursor to a shopping mall, if you will, from the Agora in Athens. A couple views of it for you there. And some of the lost treasures of the ancient world. This is a reconstruction of one of the now lost seven wonders of the ancient world, the house at Alexandria. So remember that the Hellenistic society has some of its greatest treasures actually now in Egypt. Alexandria, of course, is the Hellenized name of the capital of the Egyptian portion of the empire. Remember that Alexander is sending his generals after his death. They begin to divide up the territory that he conquered, and so it is Ptolemy, the general under Alexander, who takes control of Egypt and is in fact installing his family line into the pharaonic lineage. So when Cleopatra finally is defeated by the heir of Julius Caesar, she is a member of the Ptolemaic line. So in a sense, she's a Greek leader of Egypt. This is the city of Pergamon in reconstruction, so another outlying city away from the mainland of Greece, and it's a site of a really important temple for us. This gives you a sense of the city center, but we want to look specifically at this temple here. It's one of the most remarkable sculptural examples that I can show you from the Hellenistic era. The piece is called the Altar of Zeus at Pergamon, and what you're seeing is actually a reconstruction of it. Portions of the relief sculpture are now in Berlin, and the museum in Berlin that owns them, showing them like flat against a wall, elected to recreate the temple itself and put the sculptural pieces that they have in their correct positions. So what you see here is really kind of remarkable. Instead of a temple that's a rectangle, we now have an inverted U shape that surrounds a square shape. And those sculptures that should be theoretically either in a pediment, which of course we don't have in this form, or in a frieze, which we also don't have at the location we expected. We expect the frieze to be in the entablature above the columns and below a pediment, but without the pediment, there is no frieze above. The frieze has been moved below, and the sculptures actually spill out into three-dimensional space along the steps leading up to the temple itself. It's really remarkable accomplishment in three-dimensional illusion of space on essentially what is a more or less two-dimensional surface. A relief, of course, is a sculpture that projects or is incised into a flat surface. These figures almost become completely fully three-dimensional. And there are sculptures all along the front and sides here, and we also have the panel that's indicated here for us in green that features the main characters. We have various scenes, though, of a battle between the gods of Olympus and the Titans, or the giants. The theme is the giantocony. And so all throughout, we have, again, this sense of the Greeks representing themselves as the gods, and the giants representing the enemies that they have defeated. But it does this sort of theme that we saw in images like the battles of Lapiths and centaurs in a way that has even more dynamic movement, and in a way that engages us on a physical level. You would have to walk past this scene and then onto the steps, and the figures writhe around the corners and continue the battle as you're walking up the steps. Can you imagine? Look at this. This is almost a fully three-dimensional sculpture, really. I mean, essentially attached to a relief background, but notice how much of the sculpture put forward, and this figure's knee is fully realized as a three-dimensional object resting on the steps, and it continues the same way on the opposite side. Everywhere you look, you see swirling movement and diagonal line. Absolute precision in the carving and in the expression of the bodies, and that sense again that the Greeks have a little more nobility than their enemies, expressed in the way that the gods seem to be able to defeat these violent giants. Kind of a remarkable piece. The most important section probably is the front panel, which depicts Zeus, and you see him here defeating giants. You know he's already won. You can see his eagle and his thunderbolt, which looks kind of weirdly like a torch, but that's what this is here. And of course, my favorite panel from it is the figure of Athena. She is literally about to tear the head off of this giant. She is also surrounded by her support team and watching as the giant that she does battle with is being mourned over before he's even been killed by his own mother. She absolutely is in control in the scene. It's interesting to me to think about how ancient art begins to impact the art of the 20th and 21st centuries. This is the work, obviously, 20th century artist Robert Longo, who was born in 1953, and his images are very reminiscent of these battle scenes, although he's of course depicting corporate battles. He was well known for these images in the 1980s. Most people know the paintings, but not everyone is aware of his sculptural work, which looks a lot like the Battle of the Gods and the Giants, except these are people dressed in business, slaughtering one another for profits, I suppose. Kind of an interesting connection between the ancient world and our own.